I am the single child of two very loving parents. My mother is 56 and my father is 57 as of today. We live on a farm outside the city, but we visit the city often since the rest of my family lives there. Growing up on a farm has always been fun. I've really enjoyed living among the greenest grass that you can imagine, surrounded by different animals that you can pet, awesome nights with clear skies where you can count each and every one of the stars. Of course, the nights are also very dark, but I would never be afraid having Duke and Luke, my two guard dogs, by my side. They take their jobs very seriously and take good care of the animals. And my family, most of my father's family lives in another country, so naturally we spend the holidays with my mother's family and we are really close with each other. I feel a special connection with my Aunt Carmen. She is my mother's older sister and has always taken care of her and the rest of the family. My grandparents passed away in a car accident when my mother was only 6 years old. My Aunt Carmen was 20 at the time. She had to raise my mother and other 5 brothers and sisters by herself. My grandparents did leave some money behind, but she put aside her personal goals to raise them. You would think she would carry some sort of resentment towards her younger brothers and sisters, given that they all have successful careers and each one has a family of their own, thanks to her. But you would be wrong. You wouldn't find a more lovable person than my Aunt Carmen. She still worries for every member of our family, even when they are all grown up. One of my earliest memories with my Aunt Carmen is when I was 5 or 6 years old. I remember walking into her house. The smell of food her cooking was unbeatable. The smell was intoxicating to say the least. Every holiday we got to see the entire family gathered at a long table at my aunt's house. Such dear memories with laughs and fun all together, remembering wholesome stories and telling jokes. But time takes a toll on us all, including my aunt. It was 2 years ago. We were preparing for Christmas at my aunt's, like usual, and I heard my parents talking downstairs. "And are the doctors sure?" my father whispered, trying to keep me from hearing their conversation. "Yes," my mother replied. I had never heard a colder response from my mother, so I started thinking that things were serious. I started to listen even more carefully. "I really don't want to talk about this. Can you make the arrangements or—" "Of course, honey, that's not a problem. I am just shocked by the news, that's all." My father interrupted my mother and tried comforting her. That same Christmas, there was no cooking from my Aunt Carmen. Later I found out that my father took care of the turkey and the rest, but aside from that, I didn't notice anything unusual, and I enjoyed the holiday like every year. 6 months passed since that Christmas, and I overheard my parents talking again. "When is Romario arriving?" my mother asked. I was confused, since Romario, my youngest uncle, never visits my house. I think he doesn't like my dogs or any animal very much. I think he was arriving yesterday evening. My father wasn't sure, and I was really confused, but I figured he was just going to visit us spontaneously. I guess it doesn't matter. I just hope he takes good care of her. Apparently, my uncle had gone through a bad divorce and was going to stay at my aunt's for a while. This was some timing, because that same day, I found out that my aunt had been diagnosed with dementia since that past Christmas, so having a close family member was of great help. This disease is a long and difficult process, with therapy and especially medicine, so my mother and the rest of my family were counting on my Uncle Romario. Months passed, and the mental state of my aunt began to quickly change, for the worse. These past months she has not been able to host any sort of reunion, and we spend the holidays by ourselves. Of course, we visit her all the time, but we don't really get to see the rest of the family. I really miss those moments, but what I miss more is the smile of my aunt. She doesn't even speak to anyone anymore. She just sits in her wheelchair and stares at her garden. My Uncle Romario tells us that sometimes she would mumble a couple of words, but that's about it. Every time that we visit my aunt's house, my Uncle Romario is always present and doesn't let us stay with her for long. Rather, he would take us to the living room to hang out for a while. He says that she can sense our sadness for her, and she feels bad about it. I don't really dislike hanging out with just my uncle, but I would get bored from the grown-ups' conversation. I usually get up and wander around the big house, and not a lot of time would pass before my uncle arrives and retrieves me with his everyday kind expression on his face. Last night, everything got too dark too soon. It was 11 p.m. We were all sleeping in the complete silence of the night, surrounded by darkness. I got up to the bathroom, and I saw Duke and Luke roaming the farm, doing the usual checkups. I was wobbling back to my room and suddenly got chills on my spine. I felt scared about the darkness of my house. I felt like something was lurking in the shadows, like something was staring at my back. Then, the distance between the bathroom's door and my bedroom's door seemed infinite. Any shape in the corridor looked like a monster. I felt the urge to lock myself in the bathroom, but froze in place. Was I in danger? Was I just being dumb, feeling like I was supposed to run at full speed? I was thinking to myself. My heart began to beat heavier and heavier, and I got a knot in my throat. I wanted to scream for Duke and Luke, but I kept on walking to my bedroom, thinking if I could make it there, it would make things alright. When I was finally on my bed, it happened. My mother's phone rang. I quickly got up when I heard her screaming. What happened? Her voice was cracking, and she started mumbling some words afterwards. My parents came to my room and didn't say anything. Their faces were pale, their expressions blank. They didn't even display concern, just a complete lack of emotion. It was almost like looking at two mannequins. Turns out, my Aunt Rita was visiting my Aunt Carmen a couple of days ago, but she never made it back to her house, and she was reported missing. According to Romario, this aunt got in a cab that was kinda shady. He didn't have the chance to see the plates. My mother was shaken by all of this, thinking why nobody told her sooner. They had been looking for her for days, but now they were giving up. The next day, first thing in the morning, we were taking Duke and Luke to the vet in the city. Afterwards, we tried to call my Uncle Romario so we could visit my Aunt Carmen. He was not picking up. Anyways, we showed up at her place, but still were getting no answer. When ringing the bell, something fell off. At last, my Uncle Romario came to the door. He had half of his body behind the door. His clothes and hands had dirt on them. He was explaining that he was busy in the garden and that it was not a good time. My mother didn't care and practically pushed him aside so we could enter the house. This was a very weird situation because he had always welcomed us and any family visiting. They were all talking in the living room. When I got up to go to the bathroom, I can't explain how I knew it, but my Uncle Romario got too nervous when I got up. After I got out of the bathroom, I started walking to the garden to see my Aunt Carmen. The air felt heavy for some reason. I felt a sort of cold breeze at one point, but the windows were closed in the hallway, and I wasn't in the garden yet. I had been to the same house 1,000 times before, but I was feeling anxious for some reason, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The creaking of the floor was menacing, even more with each step. The painting in the walls appeared to be looking at me, trying to tell me something. I couldn't understand anything. I figured I was just in shock about my aunt's disappearance, and shook it off. I really wanted to see my Aunt Carmen. When I arrived at the garden, I saw her in her wheelchair, so I ran to her, just hugged her like I used to, and then she talked to me. Romario, no more medicine. Why did you do that to your sister? She was mumbling most of the words, but they were still comprehensible. I just didn't understand what they meant. I was too stunned to say something back. I took a couple of steps back and noticed my Aunt Carmen was actually staring at a pile of soil that was recently dug out. That patch of land was fixed in my eyes as I started walking towards it. With my hands, I only had to dig for a couple of seconds until I saw a tip of a blue dress buried in the garden. This only made me more fixed in finding out what was going on. I got up and looked with horror at my Aunt Carmen as she was mumbling, "My poor Rita." My eyes were wide open. My hands began to sweat at the sudden realization that my Aunt Rita was never missing. Police were looking for a taxi that my Uncle Romario described, but it never existed. Suddenly, I saw my Uncle Romario from the corner of my eye. His expression was enraged. Long was gone his everyday friendly face. Now he had a twisted smile. He was in the doorframe, blooded knife in one hand, and with the other hand, he was pulling away my mother, who was trying desperately to reach me. Her screams were tearing me inside as I stood there, looking at them and feeling helpless. My mother's screams were cut short when my uncle put his hand on her mouth. Just then I could hear the barks of Luke and Duke, who were waiting for us in the car. My Uncle Romario and I locked eyes as he was dragging my mother outside the garden, locking the door behind him. I barely saw the body of my father on the floor in a dark red pile of blood. Then it dawned on me. When my Uncle Romario was first moving in, I remember hearing something about his gambling problems. Was he in a lot of debt and stealing from my Aunt Carmen? Why was my Uncle Romario so cautious with people being alone with my Aunt Carmen, especially today? My father had consulted some other doctors, and they were all very suspicious about the fast decline in the mental health of my Aunt Carmen. Did my Aunt Rita hear my Aunt Carmen saying something like I did? Was my Uncle Romario really responsible for her death? Too much information suddenly flooded my brain. As I started to type this, I don't have a good cell phone connection in the garden, so I can't call for help. That is why I began writing this story down, in the hopes that at least someone will know the truth. After whatever happens now, I felt a familiar knot in my throat. I started feeling chills, just like last night, the feeling of something evil coming for me. But this time it's different. This evil is real, and I have no escape. Now I can't even call for my parents. I can't call for Luke and Duke. Their barks no longer resonate through the walls of the garden. I haven't been able to hear noises for a while, so I know I don't have much time left. There is this one Wi-Fi connection that I keep trying to connect to. Hopefully it will be stable enough to let me open my old account and post this. For the meantime, me and my Aunt Carmen keep on holding hands, but I can see blood flowing from the other side of the door and the knob slowly turning.